Tonight, the refugees in Rafah who say they're waiting to die. Israel has rejected a ceasefire. Iran-backed armed groups have pledged to launch more attacks unless the violence in Gaza ends. It's clear these conflicts are all linked. So just how bad could it get? At least 13 people were killed overnight in airstrikes and shelling in the city where more than half the population is sheltering. The violence and anti-American sentiment is spilling over in the region. After a US drone strike, protesters threatened revenge 10 times over as they buried an armed group commander who the US says was the mastermind behind hundreds of attacks. Another Iran-backed commander was targeted in an Israeli strike inside Lebanon as tensions creep even higher. This evening, I'll ask whether there needs to be a new diplomatic approach. And I'll have the latest on the war in Europe. That's after the Ukrainian president sacked his most senior general. What now for the counteroffensive? Plus, Donald Trump says attempts to ban him from running for president are election interference. We'll hear live from the US Supreme Court. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. It's the most densely populated place in the Gaza Strip. There are currently 1.4 million people in the southern city of Rafah living in schools and tent cities. Many have fled the Israeli offensive once, twice, some even 3 times. And now they say they're waiting to die because there is nowhere else to go. Overnight, Israeli planes bombed from overhead as tanks shelled on the ground, killing at least 13 people. After Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected a ceasefire proposal, he ordered his troops to prepare to enter the overcrowded city. And as Gazans nervously wait, the offshoots of this war are continuing to reverberate across the region. More attacks by the Houthis, another American strike inside Iraq, and growing anger too. These Iraqis are demanding revenge against the United States and calling for an end to the fighting in Gaza. They're linking this wider conflict directly to Israel's actions. So how much worse could it get if more people die in the place they were meant to be safe? More from Rafah in a moment, but let's get started in Baghdad, where our special correspondent Alex Crawford witnessed the growing tensions.
Hundreds turned out in Baghdad to mark the funeral of the man that America says has orchestrated multiple attacks on its soldiers in the region. The commander was a hero to many here, a high-ranking leader of Kataib Hezbollah, one of Iraq's most powerful pro-Iran armed groups. The commander's targeted killing has been heavily criticized by Iraqi politicians and the public alike and led to a fresh spike in anti-US sentiment.
The constant call throughout this funeral has been a demand for the US forces to pay for this, for revenge, for retaliation, and for the forces to leave Iraq altogether.
The US drone attack on a busy street in East Baghdad is a serious escalation in hostilities in the region. It was called a clear-cut assassination by Iraq's army chief, with no regard, he said, for civilians, international laws or Iraq's sovereignty. America says the Kataib Hezbollah group carried out the drone strike in Jordan last month, killing 3 of its soldiers. This was part of its response. The spillover of violence from the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, now focusing on the incredibly overcrowded Rafah area, is stretching further and becoming more dangerous. The mounting devastation and deaths in Gaza have led to nearly 200 attacks against US troops in Iraq and Syria, with pro-Iran armed groups threatening more.
I am very clear. Any place used to attack Iraqi people and Iraqi land is considered an enemy. Any hostile action from these American bases spread across the region will get a response from us.
Tensions already high in the region are creeping even higher on a daily basis. This was reported to be a drone strike by Israel on a senior Hezbollah leader in southern Lebanon. All these armed groups in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen and Iraq are aligned with Iran and known as the Axis of Resistance and are bound by their distrust of America. There was much grief at the Iraqi funeral of the Kataib Hezbollah commander, but also a great deal of anger too.
It was a barbaric, criminal attack what they did, and they acted like a mafia, not a military.
Our revenge will be 10 times what they did to us. If not today, then it'll be tomorrow.
There's already mounting pressure from the Iraqi authorities for the few thousand US troops still in Iraq fighting the Islamic State to pull out, with those at the funeral continually telling us they can maintain security in Iraq on their own. This whole region is at its most volatile for years. Alex Crawford, Sky News, Baghdad.
So calls for revenge there in Alex's report. Earlier, a senior advisor to Iraq's Prime Minister told me the United States and Iran have to stop using his country as an arena for settling scores. Farhad Alaaldin, Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister, was speaking from Baghdad.
This is a clear escalation, and it will be a destabilizing factor for Iraq, and that is in nobody's interest.
Mr. Alaaldin, the Americans say the commander that was killed was the mastermind of these attacks on US forces. Do you agree with that?
I don't know the person, so I wouldn't say that it's right or wrong, but what is wrong is that a violation of Iraq's sovereignty, and whatever happens, that should be in consultation and in coordination with the Iraqi government. Clearly, this is not
the Americans said that they were going to retaliate, that this particular commander, based on their intelligence, was the mastermind of these attacks. So I guess, the question then is, does the Iraqi government not control its own territory?
The Iraqi government controls its own territory, but when it's violated by our partners, it's going to make it difficult. The retaliation you talk about that the Americans have said for events that happen outside Iraq, and the Americans that are killed were killed outside Iraq. That has nothing to do with Iraq, and Iraq should not be an arena.
Well, they're saying this particular commander was the mastermind. Therefore, he was killed in the centre of Baghdad. I guess the next question then is, you talk about Iraqi sovereignty and concerns about these strikes escalating things. Do you feel then that Iran is using Iraqi territory for its vendetta against the United States?
What Iraq wants, and what is clear, we have been saying that Iraq doesn't want to be entangled into the any conflict between the regional and international powers, and certainly the conflict between Iran and the United States should not be folding out inside Iraqi territory. Both sides are using Iraq and other areas at the moment, and this is what we are refusing, and this is what the Iraqi government are calling for, that both sides refrain from making Iraq an arena for them.
Given, Mr. Alaaldin, the United States, Washington are your partners. They have a security pact together. Then should the Iraqi government and the military establishment be working with American forces to arrest some of these individuals?
The Iraqi government is working with the United States forces and the coalition partners and all of them to fight terrorism, that's for sure. Many attacks have been thwarted, people have been arrested, and the American and the Iraqi bases have been protected. So the American advisors were not killed in the past attacks inside Iraq.
I guess the question then also is, does this jeopardize American presence inside Iraq?
It certainly threatens the cooperation, the relationship that exists now and has been a strong relationship. It's going to make a lot of issues, because these attacks is going to be destabilizing Iraq, and this is one thing that nobody wants. It's in nobody's interest for Iraq to be destabilized.
Don't you need then American forces and presence in terms of, for Iraqi security?
The needs of American or other international coalition partners is going to be assessed in these talks that Iraq's calling for.
Are you concerned there are going to be more strikes?
The concern is definitely there, and that's why we are urging everyone, and especially the United States government, to refrain from carrying out these attacks inside Iraqi soil. They have other arenas that they can do whatever they want, but not inside Iraq. Iraq is a sovereign country, and they should work with the government closely if they have problem and threats that's coming from inside Iraq.
Mr. Alaaldin, we're grateful for your time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Farhad Alaaldin, Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister of Iraq. Well, from Baghdad to Rafah, families seeking refuge from the Israeli offensive fear that they may now be waiting to die. Half the population of Gaza is sheltering in the city, and today the White House said it would not support Israel carrying out major military operations there. That will do little to reassure the 1.4 million people who now have nowhere else to go. A conflict, it seems, without end. Millions already displaced. Entire towns and cities in ruin. Many Palestinians now forced to a small border city in the south.
I'm especially alarmed by reports that the Israeli military intends to focus next on Rafah.
But Gaza's last refuge seems likely to be Israel's next target.
Gaza will no longer be a threat to Israel.
So, how has Rafah become a lifeline in the Gaza Strip? The small city sits all the way to the south. After Hamas's attack on October the 7th, the IDF called for more than 1 million people north of the Wadi Gaza bridge to relocate.
We urge all residents of northern Gaza and Gaza City to temporarily relocate south.
Israel mobilized. Airstrikes began. By November, as Israel pushed in from the north, in Rafah, the crossing with Egypt was briefly opened. Some Gazans were allowed to leave and humanitarian aid began to trickle in. Meanwhile, Israel's operation in Gaza continued to move downward. By December, the IDF had ordered more evacuations in the south of the Strip. It once again sent millions even further south, now to Khan Yunis, on the edge of the conflict and towards Rafah.
The escalation of hostilities in Khan Yunis, which has resulted in an increase in the number of internally displaced people seeking refuge in Rafah.
But since January, the conflict has continued to follow those fleeing it. Khan Yunis now battered by Israeli airstrikes, leaving Rafah the only option for many.
What does Netanyahu want? We are civilians with no involvement. We want to eat, drink, and have shelter.
Where do we go after Rafah? Where? Into the sea?
Huge numbers of people now live in tents, with nowhere else to go. An attack there would be devastating. And after fresh airstrikes and IDF activity closing in, hope in the lifeline city is now diminishing. Situation there in Gaza for those desperate civilians. Let's bring in tonight's studio guest. Joining me is Madeline Grant, parliamentary sketch writer for The Telegraph, and Yasmeen Serhan, a writer at Time magazine. Thank you both for joining us on the programme. I, in the last 24 hours, have been speaking to a young woman from Rafah who has been speaking to us about just how terrified she is. She sent a text message saying, "It's all so close, we're so scared, we're still alive, this is what matters now." So many desperate people in Rafah now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, thinking back to before October 7th, Rafah had a population of around 280,000. Now it's about half of Gaza's population has fled there. And they fled there because they were told to flee there, right? First, but, you know, the war has effectively followed them. First to Khan Yunis, now to Rafah. It's terrifying. I have sources there who tell me it's overcrowded, that all the land is just a sea of tents. And even though my particular source says that he thankfully hasn't been displaced, people don't know where to go if and when the war will come. And they haven't gotten any warning about what will happen. They're just watching the news like we are.
And yet yesterday we saw Prime Minister Netanyahu say there will be no ceasefire and that victory is close. It will just take months. We can certainly now see Western leaders increasingly becoming frustrated with Prime Minister Netanyahu. A very different tone coming from Blinken yesterday when he was speaking to Netanyahu.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, it seems like a small thing, but even the fact that the press conference was conducted separately, Blinken in one place, Netanyahu elsewhere, is a departure, albeit a very subtle one. I mean, I think this is all, you know, very unsurprising given just the sheer volume of casualties and the terrifying prospect of what may yet unfold in Rafah is the prospect of intense fighting in an area which, as Yasmeen said, has absolutely ballooned from being a sort of smallish city to, you know, a great cluster of, as far as the eye could see, of tents, almost a city in its own right, just of tents. It's really hard to see how, with any kind of combat in that area, how the casualties could be avoided and minimised. It really doesn't bear thinking about.
No, and you know, when we hear this notion that Hamas needs to be destroyed, the only thing that we're currently hearing is a military strategy.
Right, exactly. And I think the fact that Hamas is reportedly reappearing in parts of the north suggests that perhaps this goal, it was already questioned whether it was attainable, but that it's not working, that so far the strategy that Israel has set out doesn't appear to be bearing fruit in the way that I think certainly its allies would like to see by this point, at this stage in the conflict. And the problem, of course, is that, you know, these people have nowhere to go. If they can't go further north because there's still fighting going on in the north, and certainly some have tried and sustained injuries or even been killed in the process, and they can't go to Egypt, and there's a whole load of reasons for that, then they're kind of trapped. They're stuck, and they're just sort of waiting. And, you know, I spoke with a contact there who told me, you know, I checked in, and every time you check in with someone in Gaza, you don't know if they're going to respond because either they don't have service or they may have been killed. And he told me that thankfully he and his family are okay, but that each one of us has survived death more than once. And I think the fear that many people are feeling now is that death is kind of coming closer and closer. And yeah, it's just kind of hard to see what the end game is here, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and we're also now seeing growing anger inside Israel as well, towards Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yes, and of course, that anger was there well before October the 7th. You know, there had been enormous protests, large-scale protests against his government, and that was before the shocking, catastrophic security lapses that must have led to October the 7th, and that hasn't gone away. You know, there were the scenes of the families of the hostages swarming into the Knesset and protesting, and the fact that the possibility of a deal, which although Netanyahu argued impossible to accept that deal because anything less than the destruction of Hamas, how can you possibly do business with a Hamas-led government? That too has magnified those calls to come to terms and the feeling that they are not doing all they can to bring an end to this.
But we keep hearing this phrase, the day after. There just doesn't seem to be any kind of real strategy about what that would actually look like.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can't talk about the day after because if he brings up the day after and the government starts to articulate a plan, it will expose divisions within his government. You know, his government before the war had members who, this is one of the most far-right governments in Israel's history, who abjectly oppose anything short of, say, reoccupying Gaza, dispossession of the Palestinians there. Granted, these might be considered among the fringe, not the moderate, but they are in government nonetheless. Meanwhile, you have the war cabinet, which is made up of opposition leaders. They're going to have different opinions as well. So the fact is Netanyahu politically I don't think, is in a viable position to discuss the day after. And I think that really speaks to his political vulnerability and the fact that actually he can't face the day after as well because he might not have a future in the day after.
I mean, he is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. He sort of, you know, manages to have 9 lives and reappear. Do you think that the pressure coming from the West now, talk of, you know, the idea of a two-state solution, David Cameron putting pressure as well, it will make a difference? It doesn't feel at this stage like it's changing anything on the ground.
Well, I think that Western leaders can talk all they want about their desire for a two-state solution, but there's no denying that it has never looked less likely, or at least it has become significantly less likely for the reasons that, you know, it will be impossible for Israel. Who would you do business with? Who would be in charge of a new Palestinian state? Just structurally and operationally, that is going to be very, very difficult. But I think the other thing that I find particularly alarming about this new development is the prospect of some kind of escalation. You know, as Yasmeen says, is right on the border with Egypt. Egypt has so far been fairly reticent about actually getting involved in this conflict. Yeah. They've refused to take refugees, for example, but you worry about the prospect, let's say, of just some stray rockets going over the border, and then suddenly you've inflamed someone who...
We've seen the situation there in Iraq. Madeline, Yasmeen, we'll keep you both here because, of course, we're going to continue the conversation. Stay with us, because after the break, we will be turning to the war in Europe and asking why Ukraine's president has sacked his top army general almost 2 years into Russia's full-scale invasion.
I will always remember the atmosphere at the Shanghai protests. It was an electric mix of excitement, fear and defiance, and a sense that history was being made.
We beg you to let Madeline come home.
My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeline McCann.
I've seen people who believe and strive for the American dream, even in the face of disaster.
And I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
Welcome back. There's been reports of a rift for months. Today, though, it was confirmed. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has sacked his top army general, saying it's time for renewal at the top of the military. Here he was today explaining the dismissal of Valery Zaluzhny.
A different approach is needed, in particular to rotation. Another approach to managing the front. A different approach to mobilization and recruiting. All this will give greater respect to the soldier and return clarity to actions in war.
So what do we know about the man nicknamed Iron General? He led the armed forces for 4 years. Arguably his finest moment came during the siege of Kiev. Vladimir Putin's forces were expected to capture the capital within just 3 days. But they were repelled by Western-supplied anti-tank missiles and local defense militias. Ultimately, though, he may have become a victim of his own success. Polls suggest he's the one person in Ukraine more popular than President Zelensky. He'll be replaced by Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, who earned his call sign Snow Leopard while fighting a Moscow-backed insurgency in the east in 2014. He's best known for planning and executing a counteroffensive that pushed Russian troops away from the city of Kharkiv. But he's had failures too. leading the defense of the city of Bakhmut, where thousands of soldiers were killed in one of the deadliest battles of the conflict so far. Let's talk now to Yuri Sak, former advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Defense and now advisor to the Minister of Strategic Industries. Yuri, good to see you. There have been rumours of a dismissal that have been swirling for at least the past week.
Well, yes, indeed. Good evening, Yalda. It's good to speak to you again. We have all seen different, sometimes rumors, sometimes facts. But look, one thing that we stress all the time is there's no need to over-dramatize these decisions because Ukraine is one team. And what today has shown to the world again, that 2 years into this war, this aggressive, very exhaustive war, Ukraine still acts as one team. And this is why General Zaluzhny shook hands with President Zelensky. President Zelensky offered General Zaluzhny to stay in his capacity, with his experience as member of the Ukrainian team.
I mean, he's incredibly popular, Zaluzhny, but there were differences, were there not, Yuri, between the president and his top general?
Yalda, it's very normal to have differences of opinion in a democratic society. We have them every day on different levels. But again, when it comes to important decisions, Ukraine acts as a team, and our political and military leadership is a team. And mind you, President Zelensky is Supreme Commander-in-Chief according to our constitution. So it is his responsibility to ensure issues of strategy and how we are going to fight this war going forward. At this stage, it was the
One of the things that have been raised by General Zaluzhny is the mobilization effort. He is saying we need to get more men out on the front lines, more women out on the front lines. This was a point of contention between the two men.
Yalda, one thing I would like to stress is that a lot of these rumors are very often the result of Russian disinformation campaigns. Now, all members of our political and military leadership agree unanimously that we need to conduct mobilization because it's been 2 years of this war. We need to conduct rotations of our armed forces at the front lines. And this unanimity actually is demonstrated by the fact that Ukrainian parliament is now considering a draft law that will make the mobilization process more fair, more transparent.
Are there the people, though, to fight this war? Because it's clear that Ukraine needs three things. It needs money, weapons, and Ukrainians.
Well, indeed, Yalda, at the moment, our armed forces, defense forces, count about 1 million people. And we know that our enemy is only growing their presence on the front line. So we will need more people, and we have them, of course, and there are perhaps not as many volunteers at the moment, but there are those who understand very well that it is their constitutional duty to protect our country. And, when people get these conscription notices, they go to the conscription centers. The main thing we have to ensure is that newly mobilized soldiers get proper training. And this is something that President Zelensky stressed today. And this is something that we need a new approach in.
Yuri, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you.
That was Yuri Sak speaking to us there from Ukraine. Let's bring in our panelists again to discuss. I mean, obviously, one of the spokespeople of the Ukrainian government is going to play this down and say there isn't these sorts of issues and disputes. But there have been rumours, there have been a lot of discussions around the fact that these two men did not get on.
Of course. And, he mentioned just now the photograph of the pair of them sort of shaking hands and looking very friendly. That's exactly what you do when you're trying to quash rumours of a split in a country that needs to remain divided needs not to be divided for its own survival right now. But these divisions have been rumoured for a very long time. It was thought that Zelensky's team were very upset by an essay that Zaluzhny wrote for the Economist over Christmas. That's right, in which he used the word stalemate, and they took great exception to that word. They thought it had all kinds of pessimistic connotations. They thought that he was bigging up the counter-offensive far too much, and then when it didn't prove to be the success that they hoped, they felt that this was all sort of bad comms that had not been authorised, that this has been going on for a long time, but it's going to, regardless of whether it's a sensible decision or not, you know, the most important thing to know about Zelensky is that he's adored in Ukraine, more so than Zelensky.
This is a political gamble, isn't it? I mean, no doubt, you know, that Russia is watching all of this very carefully. And ultimately, what the Russians have been waiting for is for the willpower of the West to break, and I guess for these sorts of divisions to appear within Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're seeing the divisions now, but actually my colleague Simon Schuster, who's written a book on Zelensky and the war, actually reported in his book that the tensions between the two men actually started to appear within the first few months of the war. Now, look, divisions, especially in a war of this kind, in an invasion of this kind, I imagine are very normal. But what we've seen from Zelensky is that even, you know, I saw him speak at Davos earlier this year, despite how dire the context is, the concerns about funding, the manpower, the weaponry, he's constantly trying to be positive, maybe to kind of shore up sort of Ukrainian morale in the face of a lot of serious challenges, which, as you rightly noted, Russia is going to want to see dampen, if not among Ukraine's allies, and certainly within Ukraine. So I think to the point that Madeline made about the Economist essay, if there's any sort of division from that message, he probably thinks that's a risk. But indeed, getting rid of someone who's more popular than you is also a risk. And I think a big question we need to ask now is, does Zelensky fancy a job in politics?
Well, they were supposed to have an election this year, and I actually asked the President Volodymyr Zelensky about it, and he said, well, you know, I don't want to sort of say it won't happen, but actually we are in a state of martial law, and therefore an election can't take place. And as you say, whether he wants to create a division at this point, because of course Western allies are watching very closely right now, aren't they? Especially the United States, looking for a reason not to engage any further in this war.
It's an incredibly delicate moment for Ukraine in all sorts of ways, both domestically, as you know, the general population are, you know, fatigued by the sheer number of casualties and conscription, but also just the fact that almost 2 years into this war, there are many soldiers who've barely had a break. They've been fighting constantly for the last 2 years. So you've got all that going on the home front, and then of course, you know, the prospect of a US election this year in which, you know, the top command in the US could change entirely its tune on Ukraine. And there is all of this urgency now to be seen to be making gains and for things to look rosy, basically.
And in the meantime, this very much has become a war of attrition, where, you know, whether it's a stalemate or whatever it was that Zelensky described it as, we are in this situation now.
Yeah, and unfortunately now Ukraine has to compete for attention. I mean, we were talking about Israel and Gaza before. The world's attention is divided. And I think in addition to competing for resources and funding, they're now also having to compete for attention and reminding people, as Zelensky was in Davos, that this isn't just Ukraine's war, this is the war of the wider West. But the problem is, this is a year of mega elections. Everyone's kind of navel-gazing a bit, and I think you'll see that a lot in the US as well.
Indeed. Well, speaking of the US, we're going to go there in a moment, because next up, Donald Trump called it election interference. But will the US Supreme Court agree? The state of Colorado banned Donald Trump from running for president. The court's decision will have huge consequences. We'll discuss that next. Plus, we'll hear from President Biden after an investigation found he willfully retained and disclosed classified materials. Let's turn now to some breaking news regarding the US president. A damning report released tonight has found Joe Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials when he was a private citizen. However, he will not face criminal charges. Here's how he responded in the past few minutes.
The special counsel released their findings today about their look into my handling of classified documents. I was pleased to see they reached the conclusion I believed and knew all along they would, that there are no charges should be brought in this case. As many of you know, this was an exhaustive investigation going back literally more than 40 years. 40 years when I became a United States Senator when I was a kid. I was a kid, 29 years old. Special counsel acknowledged I cooperated completely. I did not throw up any roadblocks. I sought no delays. In fact, I was so determined to give special counsel what they needed, I went forward with a 5-hour in-person interview over the 2 days of October the 8th and 9th last year, even though Israel had just been attacked by Hamas on the 7th. I was in the middle of handling an international crisis, but I was especially pleased to see the special counsel make clear the stark differences between this case and Donald Trump.
Joe Biden speaking in the last few minutes. Well, let's go straight to the United States and speak to our Mark Stone. And Mark, as we said, he will not face criminal charges, but some of the detail in this report is absolutely astonishing.
It really is. Look, I don't think the headline now is that he will not face charges, although that could have been the headline. The headline comes from the detail about the president's state of mind in the report released by this special counsel appointed by the Justice Department. I will read some of it to you because it's pretty staggering. It says, Mr. Biden's memory was significantly limited, both during his recorded interviews with the ghostwriter in 2017 and his interview with our office in 2023. He did not remember when he was vice president. He did not remember even within a few years when his son Beau died. And his memory appeared hazy when describing the Afghanistan debate that was once so important to him. And it goes on to say, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory, someone for whom many juries will want to identify reasonable doubt. That last bit in that remarkable quote explains why they didn't push for charges, because they think any jury in any case against him for having held classified documents would, to quote, see a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Quite extraordinary stuff about a sitting president. I mean, any president facing suggestions of a memory like that, this would be really bad. But for Joe Biden, it's even worse, because for so long now, there have been questions about his fitness for office. I mean, just this week, he couldn't remember the word Hamas in a news conference, had to be prompted by a member of the press. Just yesterday, he confused former German Chancellor Angela Merkel with her predecessor of a decade or two, Helmut Kohl. And at the weekend, he confused the French President Emmanuel Macron with François Mitterrand, who died in the 1990s. So for those on his own side, this will increase the concern that this is a man who should not be putting himself forward for re-election as he is. For the other side, for the opposition, well, it will supercharge any views that they have that President Biden is not fit for office. Interestingly, his lawyers who had access, Biden's lawyers who had access to this report in the days before it was released to us, clearly were not happy with the assessment of their client's memory. They say, and this is a quote, "We do not believe that the report's treatment of President Biden's memory is accurate or appropriate. The report uses highly prejudicial language to describe a commonplace occurrence among witnesses, a lack of recall of years-old events." But make no mistake, President Biden said in his statement just that you played a few moments ago, this is the end of the matter. I very much doubt it is.
No, as you say, I mean, it's extraordinary listening to you there. I'm just having a look at it myself, hearing things like he forgot when he was vice president, and when his son, as you say, Beau Biden, someone he references all the time, the fact that he forgot that he had died, utterly sort of astonishing. Bad day, as we say, for Joe Biden. What about Donald Trump?
Well, you know, I mean, all of this just presents such an extraordinary turn of events, doesn't it? And the road ahead for American politics is bizarre. Donald Trump was not in court himself, but faced a big courtroom moment today in the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, over a decision by the Supreme Court in Colorado, a lesser court, the highest court in that state, that Donald Trump should not be on the ballot in that state because he engaged in insurrection in that building back in 2021. Here's my report from the day in court.
No need to get all upset.
Prepare to see so much of this over the months ahead, the banners and the building. Because the US Supreme Court will play a huge, maybe defining role in the election ahead.
Trump's trials have just begun.
It is, of course, about one man. But here,
thank you guys.
In this first landmark case, it's about a 91-year-old woman too, Norma Anderson from Colorado, a Republican taking on Donald Trump.
He committed insurrection, and he should not be on the ballot. It's very simple.
Take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength.
Trump's involvement in all this back in January 2021, his incitement of his supporters, disqualifies him from being president. At least that's what the top court in Colorado says. They removed his name from the ballot there.
We have to decide what is the appropriate.
Now the Supreme Court of the land must decide if that decision was right.
Ordering its electors to vote.
Outside court, they listen to the voices of the lawyers and the 9 justices arguing the case.
This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection.
The lawyers arguing that Trump should be disqualified base their case on the US Constitution, which says that an officer of the state who engages in insurrection cannot be president.
The Colorado Supreme Court's decision is wrong and should be reversed for numerous independent reasons. The first reason is that President Trump is not covered by Section 3 because the president is not an officer of the United States, as that term is used throughout the Constitution.
The question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States.
From his Florida mansion, Mr. Trump couldn't resist the chance to seize the moment.
Every one of these cases you see comes out of the White House. It comes out of Biden. It's election interference, and it's really very sad.
But this didn't come from the White House or Biden. It came from his own side, people who had voted for him last time.
We think it's really important that that constitutional provision be enforced.
And what did you hear today? Are you confident?
I think we always knew that this was a tough climb.
In the end, it comes down to an interpretation of the US Constitution, a few words written 158 years ago. Do they disqualify Donald Trump from running for president again?
Now, will the court uphold the law?
The court will make its judgment in the next few weeks. If they agree with the Colorado decision, a big if, well, then it will have a profound impact. Other states could disqualify Mr. Trump too. And where would that leave a nation already so riled and divided? Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, could Israel face a ban from international football? We'll hear why some football associations in the Middle East are calling for them to be suspended.
I was actually in Poland lecturing at a conference there. Next day, climbed a mountain and had a seizure, and then that's when it had some scans which showed I had a mass in my brain, which turned out to be this glioblastoma, nasty type of brain cancer. But yeah, I was devastated. I know what cancer means, having dedicated my life to the diagnosis and treatment of cancer, to be diagnosed with brain cancer, the worst subtype, which basically is incurable cancer. Treatment hasn't changed in almost 20 years, didn't sit right with me.
After the grief, which is still ongoing, really, it's a very grim diagnosis. I set about thinking, what could we do, knowing that glioblastoma, the treatment had not changed in 20 years, being a medical oncologist. So I started thinking about how we could apply what we know in melanoma and what we've forged and discovered in melanoma about treating with immunotherapy before surgery. It actually makes the immunotherapy more effective, like a sniffer dog sniffing out drugs. If you are trained to know the drugs, when you go to the airport, you can sniff them out better. We know in melanoma that by giving the immunotherapy first before surgery, we actually get a much more sustained and effective, durable anti-cancer control from the patient's own immune system. So that was the first step. And then coming up with the novel combination, which has never been used across the world, except in, early melanoma trials. And so this is what I set about with our team from our lab. Then the most important bit was what we did with that research tissue. So planning and strategizing with Richard about resecting the tissue with our surgeon and making sure that we did all the right experiments in our lab to prove we actually activated the immune system. The drugs, the immune activators got into the tumor inside his brain, and we could see an increase in all these immune cells within his tumor. So we were really pleased with those early results.
Welcome back. Sport has always inevitably been drawn into conflict. We saw it with Russia, and now it's happening again. A group of the Middle East football associations has asked world football chiefs to ban Israel over the war on Hamas in Gaza. Israeli teams compete in the Champions League and the Europa League, and the national team is 2 games away from the Euro finals. Meanwhile, the Palestinian national team have made clear that sport is part of their resistance. FIFA is one of the only bodies worldwide to recognise Palestine, and the team made history recently by qualifying for the knockout stages of the Asian Cup. Well, let's bring in our sports correspondent, Rob Harris, in a moment. But first, let's have a listen to this explanation from a senior UEFA official on why Russia was banned, but they're not considering similar sanctions for Israel.
There are 2 completely different situations between the 2 countries, because also, don't forget the start of the war in Russia and Ukraine and the start of what is happening now, which is regrettable, of course, in the Middle East, but not.
OK, let's bring in Rob. So, Rob, just give us a sense of what the Middle East FA is saying.
Well, they're saying that Israel should be completely excluded from competitions. They're demanding a humanitarian response given the crisis, and they want the football community to act. And this is a letter I've obtained from the head of the Jordanian FA, Prince Ali bin Al Hussein. He's the half-brother of the King of Jordan, and he's leading this group of Western Asian federations. And what he says in the letter is the killing of innocent civilians, including players, coaches and others from the football community, means that Israel should be isolated until the aggression ceases. And he has cited how Russia has been banned from FIFA. But as we heard there from the UEFA leadership, they see it as 2 very different cases. And they're referencing, of course, the start of this particular war. And Prince Ali's letter does not reference the initial Hamas attacks on Israel on October the 7th, with the 1,200 people killed. And he doesn't mention, of course, the hostages that are still on Hamas territory in Gaza after being taken in those raids.
Has there been any sort of response from Israel?
Yeah, I've spoken to the head of the Israeli FA, and he's urging FIFA to keep politics out of this situation. He says he trusts them to act in the right way, which is to keep them in football competitions. And he's actually even wished Jordan luck in the Asian Cup final on Saturday against Qatar. Jordan, despite leading this opposition. And we are yet to hear from FIFA, but I am hearing there is sort of growing support in terms of that Jordan is trying to gather from across the Middle East for FIFA to act. And obviously it is coming to a key pressure point because Israel is playing those Euros qualifiers in March, trying for its men's team to reach the Euros finals in Germany. Of course, Israel has to play within European competitions because in the 1970s, effectively, it was booted out of the Asian Confederation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's this whole thing about whether politics should ever be really mixed when there is sport, but it does.
Yeah, inevitably it does. And politics is in the same way, you know, sport is reflective of the geopolitics of any given time, and that is inevitable. But it is quite, I mean, there's something to me that I find really distasteful about the idea of basically an organisation like FIFA, which is so deeply and in some cases openly corrupt by its own admission, suddenly becoming the kind of moral arbiter of geopolitics.
Yeah, sorry, I'm laughing too because I'm even just thinking, you know, politics is also just fully enmeshed in these things. I mean, we look at like how the Olympics are chosen, and obviously there are referenda with cities who say they don't want them, and then you end up having these pretty authoritarian sort of governments and countries doing them instead. So I think, unfortunately, for many sporting bodies and indeed many cultural bodies, I think it's impossible to escape the politics of these things. And look, I mean, you know, on the one hand, they kind of there's the argument valid that while these two wars are happening at the same time, they do have different contexts. They're not identical. On the other hand, I think proponents of booting Israel from these competitions would argue, look, there are two asymmetric wars going on that are resulting in intense civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. So it's certainly a tricky one, but I think they kind of opened Pandora's box when they revisited this with Russia and Belarus. And you have to remember that cultural boycotts do have an impact. They have an impact on legitimacy that I think sanctions, economic and cultural, don't.
And one of the issues was when FIFA did ban Russia, they didn't really set out the reasons why. It was very much an unprecedented situation, although set a precedent for other countries to point to certain wars and say, well, why isn't that team excluded as well?
Indeed. And Rob, you're saying that it's sort of starting to spill over into other sports now as well. I've got about a minute.
Yes, in basketball, in women's basketball, we've seen the Irish team refuse to shake hands with the Israeli team today at a qualifying match, and it all follows an anti-Semitism row with the Irish team saying they didn't want to play the Israelis and the Israelis raising issues with that. So it does have a danger, particularly as we build up to the Olympics, for this to become a very politicised part of the sporting environment. We've seen it past Olympics too, with certain athletes refusing to shake hands with Israeli competitors.
Indeed. I mean, we saw it even, you know, throughout the last couple of years where Ukrainians weren't shaking hands with certain Russian players as well. So we've, you know, it's sort of happened often and time again. But we're so grateful for all of you for joining us here on the panel. And of course, these conversations will continue. As you say, it's hard to know what will happen next. But these sort of ripple effects into sport and other areas also do take place. Thank you so much, Yasmeen, Madeline, and of course, Rob, for joining us here on the programme. Now, that's all for tonight's show. We started and finished with tensions in the Middle East. We wait to see if Israel heeds those calls from the likes of the United States and Egypt not to launch a fresh offensive in Rafah. Well, for now, good night. We'll be back next week. The news at 10 is next.